Welcome to Baking Wisdom. This is my latest series based on the brand new cookbook of the same name. My wish is to share my years of baking experience and knowledge with you so that we can be better bakers together and have some fun along the way. Now, I love making tarts. They're simple yet complex. You have the crust, the filling, the topping. So the first recipe I want to share with you is my Millionaire Tart. If you've had the square by the same name, you know it's got a shortbread cookie base, a caramel filling, and then a chocolate topping. But this is in tart form, and it allows me to share a lot of baking wisdom and insight in each and every layer. So let's start by making the short crust. This is a Sablée dough, which is a tender, but also at the same time dense crust that can hold the weight of a heavy filling like caramel and chocolate. I've already measured my room temperature butter into my bowl, and it's unsalted butter. You know I like to bake with unsalted butter so that we stay in charge of the salt. I'm using icing sugar as opposed to granulated sugar. That helps give the pastry dough a nice fine texture that gives it its structure. So making this pastry dough is as easy as making a cookie dough. You can make it by hand if you wish. And just like making chocolate chip cookies, you start by creaming your butter and sugar together. Now, another bit of baking wisdom, if you were to add a whole egg to this recipe, you would get a dough that lifts up too much. Well, we don't want that in a pie crust or tart shell, so I'm using only egg yolk. First, I'll separate an egg, and I can add it right to the bowl. Now, the next egg yolk is a funny one. I'm actually using a hard-boiled egg yolk. So you want to pre-cook your egg ahead of time, let it cool, and then you peel away the white. Of course, you can save that. Now, what you want to do is push the egg yolk either through a strainer or if you've got a microplane style zester. That way you don't get pieces of the hard-boiled egg yolk. Now, this is a little trick I picked up years ago when I was taught how to make linzer dough, the nut-based sweet dough. And what the cooked egg yolk does is it makes a dough that's easier to handle and roll, so it doesn't stick. You're not adding excess flour. It really is a handy trick. It's worth going through this effort. So now I can add that to the butter, along with a touch of vanilla. If I were making a lemon tart, I would certainly add a little lemon zest to this recipe. Just like a cookie dough, you can tailor the flavors as you wish. Now it's time for the flour. And to give a Sablée pastry dough its fine, delicate, sandy-like texture, you want to use cake and pastry flour. It's a lower protein flour and it's milled to a finer texture. Now, that said, here's another bit of baking wisdom for you. For an easy substitution for cake and pastry flour using all-purpose flour, for every 1 cup of flour needed, you measure out 2 tablespoons or 18 grams of that flour and replace it with 2 tablespoons or 15 grams of cornstarch. So that lowers the protein content of the flour, gives you the fine texture that replicates cake and pastry flour. So in it goes all at once, and a little bit of salt. All right, now you just mix this on low speed to bring it together. All right, the dough has come together. Now, this Sablée dough is just too sticky to roll right now. And even though the cake and pastry flour has a lower protein content, you still want to give time for those proteins to relax. So you can pop this in the fridge, wrap it, chill it for at least an hour or 2 before you roll it. You can make this a day ahead. It freezes wonderfully well. Just pull it out about 30 minutes before it's time to roll your dough. Now it's time to roll the dough. And so unlike a pie pastry that you want to work with ice cold and not handle it a lot before you roll it, a sweet dough, you actually want to knead a little bit before you start rolling. If you've ever had trouble with pastry cracking while you're rolling it, it might be just that the butter is a little too cold. So this just softens it up, and there it is. That's all I got. It's a little bit of wisdom, not a big piece. Just a light dusting of flour. You'll find you shouldn't need too much when you're rolling this dough. And this dough also doubles as a great cutout cookie dough if you were doing decorated cookies for a special occasion. The whole point, whether it's a tart shell or as a cutout cookie, is a pastry dough like this doesn't change its shape when it bakes, so it stays in the shell and it doesn't shrink down. Now, what I like to do is flip the dough partway through rolling, because of course all the pressure is coming from the top. So if you're going to get cracks in the middle, they're going to happen at the bottom and you don't see it until it's too late. So that's why I flip the dough, so as you keep rolling, it fuses those cracks back together. I roll a sweet dough like this to about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick, or just a little bit less. Where a pie pastry dough, you want to roll a little thinner because it does have a bit more structure to it. This is nice and tender, and we want that flavor and texture at the base of our tart. You want to know it's there. I've got my 9-inch fluted tart pan. It's got a removable bottom. You don't have to grease your pan, but I do, out of habit, always put a little sprinkling of flour in the bottom. And then you'll find, because the dough has softened a bit, that it's easy to lift up and into your tart shell. And this is where you want to take a breath and take the time to really gently work the pastry into the edge of the tart shell. And then what I like to do is gently fold over the pastry at the top and just use your rolling pin to cut at the topping. And even if you get a little overhang, you can always trim it. The next step is to take a moment and just repress the pastry into the side of the tart shell. Just the pressure of trimming the top can sometimes create a little buckle in the side. Now, the last move, to dock the pastry. Now, this seems totally counterintuitive. Why am I poking holes in the bottom of my pastry? Won't my filling leak through? So by docking it, allows any steam or heat to escape, and your pastry shell stays in place and bakes just like this. Now, I do want to pop this in the fridge for a good 20 minutes. So that gives me the perfect amount of time to preheat the oven to 325 or 160 Celsius. And then this bakes just like so for about 20 minutes until it's light golden brown around the outside. After it's cooled, well, it's time to make the caramel. And here's the tart shell out of the oven and completely cooled. You can really see how the tart shell barely moves. It doesn't shrink at all. So lots of room for that $1 million filling, which starts with the caramel. So we need to make caramelized sugar, and then we're going to add a combination of cream and butter to it. If you've ever made a caramel sauce or tried to make a caramel filling for a cake, the one thing you notice that happens is it seems to be no matter how thick you make it, it leaks and oozes. So we want a caramel that holds in place and slices cleanly, but really captures that caramel flavor. So the proportion and scale of the simple ingredients is really what counts. Whenever I caramelize sugar, I always put the water in my pot first. That way, when it hits the heat, the sugar immediately starts dissolving into the water, less room for crystallization, because that's what we want to prevent when we're caramelizing sugar. I've got my 100 grams, or half a cup of sugar. And now this is a key ingredient for this particular caramel recipe to go in the Millionaire Tart. I add glucose syrup. It is really thick and really sticky. Glucose is very important because it is an invert sugar. That means it actually has a little bit of acidity built into it. And what that does is, I'm just distracted by the stickiness here. Look at how sticky it is. Okay. Back to my bit of baking wisdom, how to clean up sticky glucose syrup. Lots of hot water. No, granulated sugar is a complex sugar made up of two simple sugars, glucose and fructose. The acidity helps break that down, and it's that prevents crystallization, both in the pot and after your caramel has set. So that's what the glucose does in this recipe, and it also helps it set. Now we're ready to move over the stove, and you want to bring this up to a full boil over high heat. It's so tempting at this point to stir the sugar. Just let it be. The sugar is going to dissolve, start bubbling, and being such a small measurement, it won't take long to caramelize. It's a good habit. It's something I've picked up over the years. Whenever you're caramelizing sugar, to have a bowl with tepid water and a brush on hand, and to just brush the sides of the pot. That keeps it clear of any sugar droplets that could risk crystallizing. But with that much glucose in this sugar, it's not going to crystallize. You want to make sure when you're making any type of caramel to have your finishing ingredients ready. So I already have measured my whipping cream, my butter, and to get the right set of this caramel layer, I've got a teaspoon of gelatin softened in a tablespoon of cold water. So I can tell I'm getting close to the sugar beginning to caramelize because the steam from the water, now that the water is evaporated, the sugar is really heating up. The bubbles seem to slow down, but it's because the sugar is becoming thicker. So the bubbles are bigger. You can even hear the difference. When you take your caramel off the heat, it will still keep cooking. So take it off the heat, just a color tone less than what your goal caramel color is. So off the heat now, and watch out for the steam when you whisk in the cream. Oh, I just made a little poem there. Watch out for the steam when you whisk in the cream. And don't worry if you see this happen. You see how the caramel isn't perfectly smooth? I still have some sort of thicker bits in there. That's because I added cold cream to hot sugar. Just slide it back on the heat and let that caramel dissolve. Heat always melts sugar. There we go, that smoothed it right out. Now I'll add my gelatin to make sure it dissolves. And then to cool everything down, I'll add my 60 grams of butter. Okay. This caramel sauce is still so hot, so I don't want to pour it directly into the tart shell. So I'll pour it into a heat-proof dish and let this cool for about 30 minutes. But really, you're just looking to cool it down. If you were to pour a hot caramel into your tart shell crust, well, it might seep into the pastry itself. Actually, now here's another bite of baking wisdom for you. To make a sweet crust a little more waterproof, liquid-proof, if you're putting in a very fluid filling, when you bake your pastry crust, take it from the oven, and while it's still hot, brush the surface of the crust with an egg white. The heat of the crust will cook the egg white, and that creates a waterproof barrier. Now it's time to put the caramel into the tart shell. Oh, beautiful. Every last bit out. Now you can see how fluid this is. It's not ready to put the ganache on top. I need to chill it for about half an hour to set it, and then the silky chocolate layer goes on top. With the caramel nicely chilled, it's time to make the chocolate ganache. Now, if you've enjoyed a Millionaire square cut into bite-sized pieces, you find that the proportion of shortbread is twice that of the caramel, and the caramel is twice that of the chocolate. I want more chocolate. So what I like about this Millionaire Tart recipe is the caramel and chocolate are in proportion. So let's make the ganache. I want to heat up a combination of whipping cream and butter together. The butter adds a little additional set to the chocolate ganache. One of the things you learn in cooking school is a ganache is equal parts by weight, cream and chocolate, and from there, You have your variations depending on what you want to do with it. Is it going to be a topping for a cake, a chocolate truffle, and that you change your proportions or you add ingredients. So I'll just bring this up on high heat. Always watch your cream though. It can boil over very, very quickly. I've got 8 ounces, 240 grams of bittersweet chocolate. This is couverture or baking chocolate. And just like the caramel, I'm adding a little bit of glucose. This time, it's not about crystallization at all. It's about adding a silky texture to the ganache that matches with the caramel when you slice into it. This is a tart that cuts so beautifully cleanly. I just love it. When you're adding hot cream to chocolate, let the hot cream do the work. You've kind of shocked the chocolate by adding the hot liquid to it, so you don't want to start stirring it right away. Let the temperatures even out. Let them literally temper. The chocolate warms up, the cream cools down, so when you stir it, it'll take less time and less agitation to get it nice and smooth. Now I'll stir the chocolate together. You can use a whisk. I'm more comfortable using a spatula just because it's a gentler motion for the chocolate. I'm not adding lots of air bubbles. All right. Now this has cooled enough that I can pour it on top of my chilled caramel layer. You need to give this tart at least 2 hours to chill, but of course you could also make this a full day ahead and just keep it in the fridge. Look how satiny glossy the top of that tart is. I leave this up to you, but I like a little sprinkling of sea salt on top of this. But you do want to add the sea salt right before you serve the tart because in the fridge, the moisture from the tart might actually dissolve the salt. Look at that. Perfect layer of caramel and a perfect layer of chocolate ganache. And now to talk with my mouth full of chocolate. It feels so satisfying to make a tart like this. You've got the pastry making, the caramelizing of the sugar, the chocolate work. Ugh, it's a phenomenal dessert. And then, on top of that, it's delicious. And that's what I love, how as you cut through, you've got an even give between the chocolate and the caramel. You know they're the same texture. Oh, that is so good. Oh, it's a perfectly balanced tart. I'm thrilled to share my baking wisdom with you, and I know you can make this recipe. It's gonna be great. Join me again for another episode of Baking Wisdom.